Untraceable poison, thought River Cartwright. Jesus wept. On the tube, an attractive brunette sat next to him, her skirt riding up as she did so. Almost immediately they fell into conversation, and, getting off at the same stop, hesitated by the escalator to exchange numbers. The rest followed like tumbling dice: wine, pizza, bed, a holiday, first flat, first anniversary, first child. 50 years later they looked back on a blessed existence. Then they died. River rubbed an eye with a knuckle. The seat opposite became free, and the woman moved into it and took the hand of the man next to her. From London Bridge River went on to Tunbridge, which his grandfather inhabited as if it were a territory annexed after a lifetime's battle. The OB could wander to the shops, pick up paper, milk and groceries, twinkle at butcher, baker and post office lady, and none of them would come within a mile of guessing that hundreds of lives had passed through his hands, that he'd made decisions and given orders that sometimes had altered the course of events, and at other times, more crucially, he'd have said, ensured that everything remained the same. He was generally thought to have been something in the Ministry of Transport. Good-naturedly, he took the blame for deficiencies in the local bus service. What enormous things must have happened, River sometimes thought, to make sure that nothing ever changed. After eating, they sat in the study with whiskey. A fire blazed in the grate. Over the years, the old man's chair had molded itself to hold him like a hammock. The second chair was getting the hang of River. As far as he knew, nobody else ever used it. "You've something on your mind," he was told. "And that's not the only reason I've come to see you." That was dismissed for the irrelevance it was. "It's Lamb." "Jackson Lamb? What about him?" "I think he's lost his mind." The OB liked that, River could tell. Liked anything that offered the opportunity for psychological spelunking. And especially liked it when River bowled him a full toss. An insight based on your rigorous medical training? He's turning paranoid. If he's only just done that, he'd not have survived this long. But you're saying he's surpassed himself. How's this particular paranoia manifesting? He seems to think there's a KGB wet squad at large. The OB said, "Well, on the one hand, the KGB doesn't exist anymore, and the Cold War's over. We won, but if you're keeping score..." "I know. I Googled it. But on the other, Russia's president used to run the KGB, who are now the FSB, by the way, and they may have changed the letterheads, but they wear the same old boots. As for untraceable poisons, that's what the KGB's special office was all about. The poison factory. Back in the 30s, a goon called Myronovsky, something like that, spent his whole career dreaming up untraceable poisons. Got so good at it, they had to kill him." River looked down at his glass. He only ever drank whiskey with his grandfather. Maybe that made it a ritual. "You're saying it's possible?" "I'm saying that any time Jackson Lamb's worried about an old-time Moscow-style op being run in our backyard, I'd pay attention. The name Litivenko not ring bells?" "Not for being untraceably poisoned." "Quite, because that was a black flag operation. You think they couldn't have made it look an accident if they wanted?" This was a favorite OB trick, turning your argument against you. Another was not giving you a chance to regroup. "Who's the victim?" "A name of Bow, Richard Bow." "Good Lord, Dickie Bow still alive? You knew him?" "Of him. Berlin hand." Putting his drink down, the OB adopted his sage pose, elbows on the armrests, fingertips pressed together as if holding an invisible ball. "How'd he die?" And when River had given him the details, said, "He was never what you'd call fast track," as if the late Dickie Bow's sluggishness preordained him for death on a bus. "Never First Division." "Premier League," River suggested. His grandfather waved away such modern abominations. "One of life's streetwalkers, and I think he had an interest in a nightclub or worked in one. Anyway, he used to come up with tidbits. Which minor official was stepping out on his wife or his boyfriend, you know the kind of thing. And all of it was fed into the files?" The OB said, "That old saw about laws and sausages, about how you never want to see either being made, the same applies to intelligence work." Dropping his invisible ball, he picked up his glass instead and swirled it thoughtfully. so the amber liquid washed round the tumbler's edge. And then he went AWOL. That was Dicky Bow's claim to fame. Went for a walk on the wild side and had switchboards lit up from Berlin to bloody Battersea. Sorry, alliteration. Bad habit. Berlin to Whitehall, because he might have been small fry, but the last thing anyone wanted right then was a British agent turning up on Red TV claiming God knew what. This was when, River asked. September 89. Ah. Too bloody right, ah. Everyone in the game, all the Berlin hands anyway, knew damn well something was about to happen. And while nobody said it aloud for fear of jinx, everyone looked at the wall while they thought it. And nobody wanted anything that might throw history off course. His swirling became agitated and wispy sprayed from his glass. Setting it on the table next to him, the old man raised his hand to his mouth and licked the drops away. When you say nobody, well, I don't mean nobody, obviously. I mean nobody on our side. He examined his hand as if he'd forgotten what it was for, then let it drop to his lap. And it wouldn't have taken much. Dicky Bow might have been just the grit of sand on the tracks to throw the locomotive. So we were keen on recovering him, as you might imagine. And evidently you did. Oh, we found him all right. Or he turned up, rather. Waltzed back into town just as we were ready to slap black ribbons on every operation he'd ever had a sniff at. Well, I say waltzed. He could barely walk, was the truth. He'd been tortured, the OB snorted. He was blind drunk, though the way he told it, not of his own volition. Held him down and poured stuff down his throat, he said. Thought they meant to drown him, he said. Of course, why wouldn't they? Drown a man like Dicky Bow in booze, you're merely speeding things up. And who were they in this scenario? The East Germans? Oh, nothing so parochial. No, Dicky Bow's story was he'd been snatched by actual hoods, the Moscow variety, and not your everyday foot soldier either. He paused, milking the moment. River sometimes wondered how the old man stood it, doing his daily rounds, butcher, baker, post office lady, without succumbing to the temptation to perform for the whole sorry bunch of them. Because if there was one thing the OB liked these days, it was an audience. No, said the old man, Dicky Bow claimed to have been kidnapped by Alexander Popov himself. A revelation which might have carried more impact if the name had meant anything to River. Drive a saint to suicide, thought Catherine Standish. Lord above, I'm channeling my mother. They were words she'd used earlier about Jackson Lamb, that he'd drive a saint to suicide. Not a phrase she'd ever expected to hear herself say, but this was what happened. You turned into your mother unless you turned into your father. That, anyway, was what happened if you let life smooth you down, playing away the edges that made you different. Catherine had had edges once, but for years had lived a life whose borders were marked by furriness and mornings when she wasn't sure what had happened the night before. Traces of sex and vomit were clues, bruises on arms and thighs, the sense of having been spat out. Her relationship with alcohol had been the most enduring of her life, but like any abusive partner, it had shown its true colors in the end. So now Catherine's edges had been planed away, and alone in the kitchen of her North London flat she made a cup of peppermint tea and thought about bald men. There were no bald men in her life, there were no men in her life, or none that counted. But there were male presences at work, and she'd grown fond of River Cartwright. But there were no actual men in her life, and that went double for Jackson Lamb. Nevertheless, she was thinking about bald men, about one in particular, giving a swift glance up at the camera before pacing into the driving rain of a railway platform, instead of boarding under shelter. And about the hat he wasn't wearing because he'd left it on a bus 2 minutes earlier. And she was also thinking, because she often did, how easy it would be to slip out for a bottle of wine and have one small drink to prove she didn't need one. One glass and the rest down the sink. A Chablis, nicely chilled. Or room temperature if the off-license didn't keep it fridged. And if they didn't have Chablis, a Sauvignon Blanc would do, or a Chardonnay, or triple-strength lager, or a 2-liter bottle of cider. Deep breath. My name is Catherine, and I'm an alcoholic. A copy of the Blue Book stood between a dictionary and a collected Sylvia Plath in the sitting room, and there was nothing to stop her settling down with it, peppermint tea at her elbow, until the wobble passed. The wobble. That was another one of her mother's. Code for a hot flush. A lot of code words her mother had used, which was almost funny, given what Catherine did for a living. So what would her mother make of her now if she were alive? If she could see Slough House, its flaky paintwork, its flakier denizens? Catherine didn't need to ask, because the answer was blindingly clear. Her mother would take one look at the worn-out furniture, the peeling walls, the dusty bulbs, the cobwebs that hung from the corners, and recognize it as somewhere her daughter belonged, somewhere safe from aspiration. It was better to build your life ceiling low, better not to put on airs. Better in the long run not to think about what lay behind you. So picking up her peppermint tea, Catherine carried it into her sitting room, and for the many hundredth time didn't go out for a bottle. Nor did she browse the Blue Book, let alone Sylvia bloody Plath, but instead sat and thought about bald men and their actions on rainy railway platforms. And she tried not to think about her mother or about life's edges being planed away until you could see clear past them into whatever came next. Because whatever came next, it was best to assume the worst. From the 77th floor to this, thought Louisa Guy. Holy crap. A Broadsheet's Beautiful Homes column had lately informed her that a little imagination and a small amount of cash could transform even the tiniest apartment into a compact, space-efficient dream dwelling. Unfortunately, that small amount was large enough that if she'd laid her hands on it, she'd have moved somewhere bigger instead. As ever, damp washing was tonight's motif. A clothes horse designed to be folded out of sight when not in use was always in use, and anyway there was nowhere to put it when it wasn't. So it leaned against a bookshelf draped with underwear, her collection of which had undergone significant upgrading since Min Harper had entered her life. Elsewhere, blouses hung on wire hangers from anywhere they could be hooked, and a still damp sweater reshaped itself on the table, its arms dangling heavily over the sides, and Louisa perched on a kitchen chair, laptop on her knees. It was a fairly basic research technique, but Googling the day of Spiderweb's mini-summit was the first port of call. This revealed an international symposium on advanced metallurgical processes at the LSE, and a conference on Asiatic studies at SOAS. Tickets went on sale for an ABBA reunion gig, and were expected to sell out inside 2 minutes, while central London would be more of a lunatic's day out than usual because there was a Stop the Banks rally marching down Oxford Street. 250,000 demonstrators were expected. Traffic, tube, and normal life would doubtless come to a halt, none of which had any obvious connection with the Russian visit. It was background, but background was important, and after the last time the slow horses had become embroiled in Regent's Park business, she wasn't relying on info supplied by web. But it was hard to concentrate. Louisa kept remembering that huge floor space in the Needle. She'd rarely been anywhere so roomy without being outside, a thought that inevitably dragged her home, a rented studio flat on the wrong side of the river. And now, too, sometimes 3 nights a week, Min was here too. And while this was still a good thing, it wasn't without its downside. Min wasn't messy, but he took up room. He liked to be clean and fresh when he came to her bed, which meant yielding precious inches of her bathroom shelf. He needed a clean shirt in the morning, so required wardrobe space too. DVDs had appeared, and books and CDs, which meant more physical objects in a space that was getting no larger. And then there was Min himself, of course, who didn't lumber about, but didn't have to. The mere fact of his presence brought the walls nearer. It was nice to be close to him, but would have been nicer to be close somewhere spacious enough to be further apart. Elsewhere in the building, a door slammed shut. The resulting draft whistled along the hallways and whispered under doors until, with a noise like snow sliding off a roof, a blouse fell from its hanger to the floor. Louisa studied it for a moment or two, as if the situation might rectify itself without her intervention, and when this didn't happen, she closed her eyes and willed herself elsewhere, and when she opened them again, that hadn't happened either. A drafty, rented studio flat, with one extra terrible characteristic, that for all its faults, it was several steps up from Min's bedsit. If they wanted to find somewhere nice together, they were going to need money. 11:30, 6.5 hours to go. Frigging hell. If he'd been asked to draw a picture of what he'd expected from private security work, Cal Fenton would have drawn it big. There'd have been manual combat training, utility belts, Kevlar vests, tasers, and driving too, rubber shredding takeoffs and sharp cornering. He'd have had one of those earpieces with a hands-free mic attached, a necessity in the adrenaline-rich world of the security consultant, where you never knew what the next second might bring. That was what Cal Fenton had had in mind. Danger, excitement, a grim reliance on his own physical competence. Instead, he had a uniform that was too small, because the last guy on the job had been a midget, plus a rubber torch with a fading battery. And instead of riding shotgun in an armored limo, he had a nightly trudge up and down half a dozen corridors, calling in every hour on the hour, less to reassure management that the facility was still standing than to prove he was awake and earning his pay, which was so slightly above minimum wage that if you split the difference, you'd have change from a quid. A job was a job, his mum never left off saying, but flush with the wisdom of 19 years on the planet, Cal Fenton had found the flaw in this argument. Sometimes a job was a pain in the arse, especially when it was 11:31 and there were 6 hours, 29 minutes to go before you were out the door. Speaking of which, Cal was on the ground level, pacing the facility's east side corridor, and the door at its far end was open. Not hanging wide, but not firmly closed. Either someone had opened it since Cal's last circuit, or Cal hadn't closed it after his cigarette. Cal and only Cal, because night shift was a one-man job. Reaching the door, he pushed it gently. It opened with a creak. Outside was an empty car park, bordered by a mesh fence, beyond which a potholed road disappeared into the shadow of the Westway. The building opposite used to be a pub, and maybe hoped to be a pub again one day, but for the time being was making do with being an eyesore. Posters for local DJs peeled from its boarded-up windows. After watching for a moment, Cal pulled the door shut. He stood in silence, aware of his heartbeat. But there'd been nobody outside, and there was nobody inside either, himself excepted. 11:34. He stepped away from the door and checked the office. Office. Facility. You could get away with words like that if you weren't exposed to the reality. Because the office was a glorified broom cupboard and facility, an up-itself name for a warehouse, windowless brick on ground level, then wood for the second story, like they'd run out of bricks halfway. It was newer than whatever had stood in the same place previously, but after that you ran out of compliments. Like the once and future pub across the road, the whole place was basically counting out time until the area hit an upward swing, but that figured. Data lock was a cut-price operation, and what you got was less than what you saw, especially if what you'd been looking at was the company catalog. Cal swung the torch in big, forgiving loops. There was nobody in the office, least of all a guard dog, which a sign on the main gate warned patrolled the premises 24/7, but the sign came in at $4.99, which was a lot less than 24-hour guard dog presence cost. And then he heard something along the north corridor, a scuffing noise, as if a heel had kicked against the floor. Cal's heart phoned in loud and clear. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Exactly as normal, only twice as loud and 4 times as fast. 24 minutes until his check-in call, which he could make early, of course, on account of being totally spooked. And here's how that conversation would go. I think I heard a noise. You think you heard a noise? Yeah, along the corridor, like there might be someone there, but I haven't looked to see. Oh, and the door was open, but I might have left it open earlier when I nipped out for a smoke. Do you want to send reinforcements? With combat training, utility belts, and Kevlar vests. But even a pain-in-the-arse job was better than none, and Cal really didn't want to lose out on paid employment because a squirrel had wandered in. He weighed his torch in the palm of his hand. It felt solid enough, baton-like, and suitably reassured. He stepped out of the office and into the north corridor, at the end of which was a staircase. The corridors were on the building's outer edges. The downstairs office was where the security shifts, himself and an edging 70 ex-copper called Brian, kept their stuff. Upstairs there was a tech's room where incoming was processed, and the rest of the facility was a labyrinth of storage rooms apart from the number pasted above each doorway. The bastards all looked the same. Sounded the same too, a constant humming. This was the noise information made when it was waiting to be used. That was what he'd heard one of the techies say once. He was halfway along the corridor when the lights went out. Never heard of him. Oh, poppycock. Which was unlike the old man. Put it down, River thought, to being on his third glass. He said, No, all these years you've been telling me spook stories, Alexander Popov's never rated a mention. That earned him a sharp look. I haven't been telling stories, River. I've been educating you. At least that's always been my intention. Because if the OB ever learned he turned into an old gossip, it would have destroyed something deep inside him. River said, That's what I meant. But Popov's never formed part of my education. I'm guessing he was Moscow Center, yes? One of their secret wizards pulling levers? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, the OB quoted. That's quite good, actually, but no. What he was a bogeyman. Smoke and a whisper, nothing more. If information was hard currency, the best we had on Popov was an IOU. Nobody ever laid a finger on him, and that was because he didn't exist. So how come, River began and stopped himself. Asking questions is good, an early lesson. If you don't know something, ask. But before you ask, try to work it out for yourself. He said, So the smoke and the whispers were deliberate. He was invented to have us chasing someone who wasn't there. The OB nodded approval. He was a fictional spy master running his own fictional network. It was meant to have us tying ourselves in knots. We did something similar in the war, Operation Mincemeat, and one of the lessons we learned from that was you can discover an awful lot from the details you're asked to believe. You know how the service works, Peter. The boys and girls in background prefer legends to the real thing. Truth walks a straight line. They like to peep round corners. River was used to ironing out the kinks in his grandfather's conversation. If the details you were being fed were fake, that didn't mean they couldn't tell you anything. If Moscow Center said, Look at this, the sensible thing was to look in the opposite direction, the OB agreed, and then said, It was all a game, wasn't it? In a tone suggesting he'd fallen upon a long-hidden secret. And they were still playing it when everything else they owned was up for grabs. The fire crackled and the old man turned his attention to it. Watching him fondly, River thought what he often thought when they dwelt on such subjects, that he wished he'd been alive then, had had a part to play. It was a wish that kept him at Slough House, jumping through hoops for Jackson Lamb. He said, There was a file then, on Alexander Popov? Even if it was full of fairy tales, what was in it? The OB said, God, River, I haven't given it a thought in decades. Let me see. He peered into the fire again as if expecting images to emerge from the flames. It was patchwork, an old woman's quilt. But we had his birthplace, or what we were led to believe was his birthplace. But let's not go round that bush again. The story was he came from one of those closed towns. You know about them? Vaguely. They were military research stations served by civilian populations. His was in Georgia. Didn't have a name, just a number. ZT-53235 or something like that. Population of maybe 33,000. The creme were scientific staff with the service industry propping them up and military to keep them under control. Like most of these places, it was founded in the post-war years when the Soviet nuclear program was in overdrive. That's what the town was about, you see. It was not organic. It was purpose-built. a plutonium production plant. ZT-53235, said River, who liked to keep his memory sharp. His grandfather looked at him, or something like that. He turned back into the fire. They all had names something like that. Then he sat straighter and got to his feet. Granddad? It's okay, nothing. Reaching into the log basket to the side of the fireplace, the old man pulled a long, dry twig from the sheaf of kindling. Come on now, he muttered. Let's be getting you out of there. He held the twig into the flames. He'd seen a beetle, River realized, a woodlouse, scuttling blindly on the topmost log of the burning pyramid. Despite the heat, his grandfather's hand remained steady as he leaned forward, the end of the twig positioned so that the beetle's next circuit would bring it immediately into its path, whereupon the dying creature would presumably launch itself gratefully upwards, as if upon a rope dangled from a helicopter. What was beetle for Deus ex machina? But the beetle had no words, Latin or otherwise, and avoided the offered escape route, making instead for the uppermost point of the log, where it balanced for a moment, then burst into flames. River's grandfather made no comment. He simply dropped the twig into the fire and settled back in his armchair. River was going to say something, but turned the words into a throat-clearing noise instead. The old man said, "That was back in Charles's day, and he got quite exercised about it in the end. Talked about wasting time on fun and games when there was still a war going on if nobody had noticed." The OB's voice changed with these words as he indulged in that harmless habit of imitating someone your listener had never met. Charles' partner had been the service's first desk once upon a time, and this was the man Dickie Bowe claimed kidnapped him. Yes, though to be fair to Dickie, when he came up with his story, it hadn't been firmly established Popov didn't exist. He must have seemed like a good enough alibi at the time for whatever Dickie was up to. Drinking and whoring, probably. When he realized his absence had sent balloons up, that was the story he invented. Kidnapped. And did he say what Popov wanted? I mean, kidnapping a streetwalker? He told everyone who'd listen, and quite a few who wouldn't, that he'd been tortured. Though, as this took the form of being made forcibly drunk, he had difficulty summoning up sympathy. Speaking of which, but River shook his head. Any more, and he'd know about it in the morning, and he ought to be getting home soon. To his surprise, his grandfather refilled his own glass. Then he said, "That closed town, the one he was supposed to come from." River waited. "It disappeared from the map in 55, or would have done if it had been on a map." He looked at his grandson. Closed towns didn't officially exist, so there wasn't a lot of admin involved. No photographs to airbrush or encyclopedia pages to replace. What happened? Some kind of accident at the plutonium plant. There were a few survivors, we think. No official figures, of course, because officially it never happened. River said 30,000 people. Like I said, there were some survivors. And they wanted you to believe Popov was one of them, River said. His mind was conjuring a story from a comic book, an avenger arising from the flames. Except, what was there to avenge after an industrial accident? Perhaps they did, his grandfather said, but they ran out of time. Our net filled up once the wall came down. If he'd been flesh and blood, one of the bigger fish would have offered him up. We'd have had the whole biography, chapter and verse. But he remained scraps, like an unfinished scarecrow. Some reptile dropped his name in a debriefing session, but that was an admission of ignorance by then because nobody believed in him anymore. The OB turned from the fire as he finished. Light from the flames emphasized the creases in his face, turning him into an old tribal chief, and a pang ran through River as he realized there wouldn't be many more evenings like this one, that there ought to be something he could do to eke them out. But there was nothing, and never would be. Learning that was one thing, living it another entirely. Careful not to let those thoughts show, he said. Dropped his name, how? There was a code word involved. I can't remember what it was. The old man looked into his glass again. I sometimes wonder how much I've forgotten, but I don't suppose it matters now. Admissions of weakness were not on their usual agenda. River put his glass down. "It's getting late. I hope you're not going to start humoring me. Not without a bulletproof vest." "Be careful, River." That gave him pause. "What makes you say that?" His grandfather said, "The street light at the end of the lane's gone. There's a dark stretch between there and the station." Which was true enough, it turned out, though River didn't believe that was what had been uppermost in his grandfather's mind. Cal Fenton was glad no one was around to hear him yelp like a girl in the dark. Jesus Christ! Though mostly he was worried there might in fact be someone around. It wasn't a generator blowout. The towers were humming. All that information safe and snug in electric cocoons. The lights were on a different circuit, and it might just be a power cut. But even as Cal's mind reached for that possibility, his bowels were acknowledging that if there ever was a power cut, it wasn't going to happen 2 minutes after he'd noticed the door was open or heard a scuffing noise. Ahead of him, the corridor was empty of everything but shadows, which were larger and more fluid than usual. The stairs ascended into bigger blackness. Gazing into it, Cal's breathing became faster, and his grip on the torch tightened. He couldn't guess how long he stood there. 15 seconds? 2 minutes? However long it was, it came to an end when he hiccuped. An unexpected, belly-deep hiccup which surfaced as a squeak. The last thing Cal wanted was to face an intruder who just heard that. He turned. The corridor behind him was empty too. Heading along it, he broke into a jog as unintentional as his recent paralysis. This, then, was how Cal reacted in an emergency. He did whatever his body told him to do. Stand still, wave a torch, run. Danger, excitement, a grim reliance on his own physical competence. Back in the office, he flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The telephone hung on the wall opposite. Swapping the torch from his right hand to his left, he reached for it, and the receiver molded to his grip with the exact smooth plastic shape of a baby's bottle. But the comfort only lasted a moment. In his ear there was nothing, not even the distant sea sound of a broken connection. He stood, torch pointing nowhere. The door, the possible noise, the lights, now the phone. Taken together, there was no chance he was still alone in the facility. He replaced the receiver carefully. His coat hung on the back of the door, and his mobile was in its pocket. Except it wasn't. First thing Cal did was check his pockets once more, a little more quickly, and the second was to do it again, more slowly. All the while his mind was racing on different levels. In one gear, he was repicturing his movements on getting to work, checking his mental negatives in case they revealed where he'd left his phone, and in another he was unfolding what he knew about the facility. Info dump, the techies called it. Dumping, he'd learned, was what you did with a near infinity of digital knowledge which nobody was going to want to consult again, barring remote circumstances involving lawyers. If not for that, the digital archive stored here would have long been erased. Though erased wasn't the word he'd heard used. That had been released, and when he'd heard it, the image was of information being uncooped like a flock of pigeons, bursting into the air to the sound of applause. The phone was nowhere. Someone had broken into the facility on Cal's watch, had fixed the lights, killed the phone, stolen his mobile. It was unlikely that having done this, they'd quietly left. His torch beam wavered, as if this would be the next thing to go. Cal's throat was dry and his heart pounding. He needed to step out of the office and patrol the corridors, head upstairs and check out that unlit labyrinth with all its stored knowledge, and he had to do this with a horrible chorus beating away in his brain. That, sometimes, information is worth killing for. From the corridor where the shadows had gone to hide came the soft squeak of a rubber-soled shoe on lino. And if information was worth killing for, thought Cal Fenton, someone generally had to die. A quiet night in, thought Min Harper. Bloody hell. He poured a drink and surveyed his estate. That didn't take long. Then he sat on his sofa, which was also his bed, though if dull technicality were to intrude, neither were his. They came with the room. which was L-shaped, the foot of the L being the kitchen area, a sink, a microwave atop a fridge, a kettle on a shelf, and the longest wall boasting 2 windows, the view from both being of the houses opposite. Since moving into a bedsit, Min had taken up smoking again. He didn't do it in public, but in the evening he'd hang out of a window and puff away. In one of those houses opposite, a boy was often doing the same thing, and they'd give each other a wave. He looked about 13, the same as Min's eldest, and the thought of Lucas smoking gave Min a pang in his left lung, but he didn't feel anything about this kid doing it. He supposed that if he'd still been living at home, a sense of responsibility would have kicked in, and he'd have had a word with the kid's parents. But then, if he'd been living at home, he wouldn't have been hanging out of the window smoking, so the situation wouldn't have arisen. In the time it took him to think this, he finished his drink, so he poured another, then hung out of the window and smoked a cigarette. The night was cold, with a hint of rain later. The kid wasn't there. When he was done, he returned to the sofa. It wasn't a particularly comfortable sofa, but the bed it unfolded into wasn't comfortable either, so at least it was consistent. And its lumpy narrowness was only one reason Min wasn't in the habit of bringing Louisa back here. Others being the way the cooking smells hung around all night, and the peeling floor in the bathroom down the hall, and the borderline psycho in the room below. Min should move, get his life back on a proper footing. It had been a couple of years since everything went down the pan, a process that had begun when he'd left a classified disc on the tube, and woken next morning to find its contents being discussed on Radio 4. He'd been at Slough House within the month. His domestic life collapsed shortly afterwards. If his marriage had been strong to begin with, he sometimes lectured himself, it would have survived his professional humiliation, but the truth he'd come to understand held a tighter focus. If he himself had been strong, he would have ensured that his marriage survived. As it was, his marriage was definitely a thing of the past, what with Louisa being on the scene. He was pretty sure Claire wouldn't tolerate that particular development, and while he hadn't told her about it, he wasn't convinced she didn't know. Women were born spooks and could smell betrayal before it happened. His glass was empty again. Reaching to refill it, he had a sudden glimpse of a future in which this never changed, one in which he was always in this soul-destroying room and never released from the career-ending Slough House, and he knew he couldn't let that happen. The failures of his past had been atoned for. Everyone was allowed one mistake, surely. This olive branch from Regent's Park in the shape of Spiderweb Summit, all he had to do was grab hold of it and be pulled ashore. If this was a test, he intended to pass it. Nothing at face value. That had to be his mantra. He'd assume everything held a hidden meaning and keep digging until he found what it was. And trust nobody. That was the most important thing. Trust nobody. Except Louisa, of course. He trusted Louisa completely. Which didn't necessarily mean keeping her in the loop. Once River had left, the house grew quiet enough for David Cartwright to replay their conversation. Fiery damn. ZT/53235, he'd said. And River had been sharp enough to repeat it back to him. It wasn't a name he'd forget because River had always been able to recite phone numbers, car registrations, test match scores months after reading them. It was a gift, Cartwright liked to think, the boy had inherited from him. Certainly one he'd encouraged River to cultivate. So sooner or later he'd wonder how come his grandfather had got this particular name digit perfect when he'd been making a bit of a performance of losing details here and there. But you didn't grow old without being accustomed to there being things beyond your capacity to change. So David Cartwright filed that one in a memory drawer and resolved not to let it vex him. The fire was dying. That woodlouse had scuttered about in evident fear, and at the last second had thrown itself into the flames below, as if death were preferable to the moments spent waiting for it. And this was a woodlouse. That human beings in similar straits had reached the same conclusion was a matter of televised fact, and not one David Cartwright cared to dwell upon. His memory was full of drawers he kept shut. Take Alexander Popov. If he'd never mentioned that name to his grandson, it was for the reason he'd given, that he hadn't spared the creature a thought in over a decade. And this too was for the stated reason. Popov was a legend and did not exist. As for Dickie Bowe, he'd clearly been a drunkard who'd seen his usefulness to the service drawing to a close. His claim of a kidnapping had been a last-gasp attempt to score a pension. That he died on a bus without a valid ticket didn't strike Cartwright as an out-of-the-way ending. On the contrary, it had been on the cards from the opening credits. But Jackson Lamb appeared to think otherwise, and the trouble with that old Joe wasn't that he spent his life thinking up ways of tormenting his slow horses. It was that, like most old Joes, once he got it in mind to start pulling on a thread, he wouldn't stop till the whole damn tapestry unraveled. And David Cartwright had seen so many tapestries, it was hard to know where one started and the next one stopped. He picked up his glass again, but set it down on finding it empty. Another drink now and he'd sleep like the dead for an hour, then lie wide-eyed until morning. If there was anything he missed about being young, it was that careless ability to fall into oblivion, like a bucket dropped down a well, then pulled up slowly, replenished. One of those gifts you didn't know you possessed until it was taken away. But in addition to growing accustomed to there being things beyond your capacity to change, the old also learned that some things changed without your knowing. Alexander Popov had been a legend, Cartwright thought. Alexander Popov hadn't existed. He wondered if that were still the case. He continued to stare into the dying fire for some while, but in the way of things that were dying, it didn't reveal anything he didn't already know.